others died to create me. And now you will too.
What's up YouTube, it's your boy Young Devin2 back at it again with yet another Spider-Man game review, and this is another game that played an important role in my gaming experience as a kid, and that would be Ultimate Spider-Man for the GameCube. Not only did I play this game a ton, but this is one of the two games I got when I first got my GameCube for Christmas 2005. I got the Pokemon Gale of Darkness GameCube, which of course came with the game, and also a silver GameCube with a Pokemon faceplate. Couldn't tell you the name of the Pokemon. As I've never been into Pokemon, it was a no-brainer that I would be putting most of my time into the Spider-Man game. It was around this same time that I was introduced to comic books. I've said it in several other videos that Spider-Man is my favorite superhero, but it was the Ultimate Spider-Man incarnation that got me hooked. For those not familiar with the Marvel Ultimate Universe, it was a secondary universe that existed separately from Marvel's main continuity, where many classic characters had their origins retconned to fit modern times. This was so that new fans could get into comic books without having to know 50 plus years of storylines to start reading. Some examples of major differences include the introduction of the Black Nick Fury, whose appearance was based off of Samuel L. Jackson, who would later play the character in the MCU, or the fact that mutants were not the evolutionary successors to humans, rather experiments to recreate the Captain America Super Soldier Serum. There's a lot more differences than that, and I recommend checking out the Ultimate Universe comics like the Ultimates, which are basically the Avengers, Ultimate Spider-Man of course, and even Ultimate X-Men. I've also heard good things about Ultimate Fantastic Four, but haven't gotten the chance to check it out for myself. But let's get into the review. I do want to say spoiler alert for this retrospective. I plan on going into detail on the story of this game and the comic book, so click off this video if you haven't played it but plan on it. You've been warned. Now let's talk about the story, which in my opinion is the main reason you should play this game. In my review of Spider-Man 2000, I briefly explained how a lot of superhero video game stories are based on popular story arcs from the comics, or they create a brand new story for the game. I would say that Ultimate Spider-Man is a combination of both. Although I personally enjoy this, it's also one of my biggest complaints I have of the game. I think this game's story is more geared towards the readers of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics as opposed to appealing to regular gamers or even fans of the two Spider-Man movies that had released over the previous 3 years. Although the game's intro cutscene does a good job at explaining the plot between Peter Parker as Spider-Man and Eddie Brock as Venom, there are a lot of plot elements taken directly from the comic that aren't ever explained. Now the game's story follows former childhood friends Peter Parker and Eddie Brock, whose fathers were scientists and colleagues who created something called the suit. This is essentially a man-made symbiote created with the intentions of curing diseases like cancer. Instead, it increased the user's physical abilities drastically and caused them to have an intense hunger for other living beings, mainly Peter Parker. The suit was created using Richard Parker's DNA and needs a Parker host or victim to remain stable. Their parents were killed by this monstrosity, and the now orphaned friends wouldn't see each other until years later. When they finally reunite, Eddie shows Peter their father's life work, and after briefly using it, Peter realizes it's way too dangerous and destroys a sample. Angered by this, Eddie uses another sample, becoming Venom. Lacking most Parker genes, he must eat other people to prevent the suit from consuming him, and only ever feels at peace when he's in the vicinity of Peter. This part was never really clear. The symbiote clearly has some mind of its own, but it's never clarified whether it wants to be bonded with Peter or to consume him. The player is thrust right in the middle of this conflict, playing as both Spider-Man and Venom with their paths crossing several times. Again, I think this is a great main story, but it ignores other plot elements from the comic while still trying to progress them. I think the biggest example of this would be the presence of Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. Although Norman Osborn is an important part of the regular Spider-Man mythos, he is vital to Ultimate Spider-Man, as it was at Oscorp that Peter was bit by the infamous spider, which gave him his powers. This is never mentioned in the game, and when we are introduced to the Green Goblin, he is never referenced as such or as Norman Osborn. With the purple pants, it would be very easy for a casual fan to mistake him for being the Hulk. When we first see him, he is broken out by the Beetle, who at this point had not been introduced in the Ultimate Comics. We find out 3 years later that he's a Ledverian agent sent to take the symbiote. Now with this knowledge and knowing Norman Osborn to be this corrupt billionaire with infinite connections, it kinda makes sense for the Beetle to break him out, but we wouldn't get this information until 3 years later. Now I normally don't get too wrapped up in comic book accuracy, but at the time of release this game was considered canon to the comic, so it should have flowed better. I have similar issues with the other villains like Electro and Rhino. Both had already made appearances in the comic, but no references are made to their past experiences. At the very least, with your encounters with Electro, it's a lot more clear that he knows who Peter is and hates him. But enough complaining about what I dislike about this story, let's talk about what I enjoyed. While I think the gameplay of Spider-Man was a bit limited and is like a dumbed down Spider-Man 2, the switching between being a hero to a predator as Venom makes this worth playing. Despite Venom not having as much dialogue in the game as Peter, you really get the sense of desperation having to consume people to stay alive, and aimlessly wandering and killing people. Venom's singular goal in each level is to destroy, and even though the gameplay is basic, it's fun to do so. I streamed this game in its entirety in one sitting and honestly didn't get bored thanks to the constant switching between characters. Outside of that, I don't have too much to say about the gameplay because there's not much to it. You start out only able to do 3 hit combos using the punch and kick buttons, and progressing through the game it increases to 4 and later to 5. There's no skill tree or unlockable moves. What you start off with is what you use for the duration of the game. I think Spider-Man 2, which was released a year before in 2004, had the issue of having too much of everything, too many skills to unlock, and too many side events. In Ultimate Spider-Man, I feel like Treyarch tried to find a perfect medium and instead took too much out. This game controls just fine, but it's definitely a step down from the previous game. To progress to the next level, you're given different tasks that are seen in your to-do list. This could be races where you run through orbs and hoops as fast as possible, or combat tours where you go through a gauntlet of different gangs in certain areas. The other thing you're expected to do often are city events, which is you doing basic hero stuff, like stopping a speeding car by beating it to smithereens, saving people hanging from a ledge from falling and falling anyway, and also playing ambulance because the hospitals don't seem to have their own. Again, the city events seem to be a leftover from Spider-Man 2 where you would talk to civilians to do various tasks and gain points to start the next chapter. That was my least favorite part of that game, so I honestly don't mind this being a dumbed down version of it. Now let's talk about the visuals, which I also think is a mixed bag. While Spider-Man 2 included a large environment to swing through with plenty of detailed buildings, this game features a smaller landscape with a shorter draw distance and many buildings lacking detail. Despite this, I like the visuals in parts. I generally do not like cel-shaded graphics, which was a huge fad at the time, but I thought it worked well in illustrating the comic book style along with the panels throughout the cutscenes. My main complaint as far as the visuals is the lack of detail. You can barely see the lines on Spider-Man's costume, and the flames we see around Human Torch look like this. Now earlier in the video I explained that this game was originally considered to be canon to the Ultimate Spider-Man comic, and while that is no longer the case, many elements from the game would be used in the comic. In the game we see Venom consume the carnage never the host, and it is instead a clone of Gwen Stacy. Venom still consumes the red goop, but turns into a large black blob instead of his classic comic self. Despite all the negative things I had to say, I still really enjoyed this game, and similar to my judgment of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, I would say this is the start to a great game. Had they at least taken the time to polish the visuals, I think they would have made a tremendous difference. I would rate this a 7 out of 10. I don't know if I would recommend going out of your way to seek this game out, but if you can find it for a decent price, definitely play it for the story. Once you finish the story, you're able to switch between Spider-Man and Venom at will. And now being able to free roam as Venom, there are a few races and even a GTA-like survival mode where you cause as much mayhem as possible fighting the police, working your way up to facing S.H.I.E.L.D. There are also unlockable costumes and comic covers to unlock, which is cool if you're into that type of thing, but all you're doing to get them is collecting tokens, which you're likely not going to get through during the main story, and there's not much incentive to do so after. But that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching until the end. Let me know what your favorite Spider-Man game is, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out my Twitch where I play a slew of games, including this one. I'm out.
Yes! Eddie? Eddie, what's going on?
I have absolute, total control. Now then, I have a score to settle.
He's out there. And I don't know if I'm scared of him or for him.